The war in Ukraine could soon get very, very interesting in a way that we haven't actually seen up to this point in the war. In fact, there are a lot of big developments right now that we have been talking about for a very long time that seem like they are potentially coming to a head, and in fact are coming to a head sooner than I even thought they would. And a lot of different things are happening, not just one or two things, but a lot of different things are happening all at the same time that really could change the direction of the war and the way that the world perceives the way the conflict is going. What I'm going to talk about in today's video will be very significant. In fact, it will be much more significant than most people will even notice or will give it credit for. And that's because Vladimir Putin recently and quite accidentally revealed his greatest weakness and the thing that he is actually the most afraid of. Not because he wanted to, but because he didn't have a choice. He was faced with a dilemma, and in that dilemma, his weakness has been exposed. And Ukraine is now taking advantage of that weakness in every way possible, and they are doing it very successfully in a way that could easily be expanded upon to become very catastrophic for Vladimir Putin and for Russia very, very quickly. In fact, right now, Ukraine is definitely hitting Russia where it hurts the most, but it could be easy to miss because at first glance, it doesn't look like Ukraine is doing anything substantially different from what they've been doing for several years throughout the war. But when you actually look deeper, when you look at the specific details of what's happening right now, when you look at the specific targets that Ukraine is striking, and the frequency with which they're striking these targets, and the overall geopolitical context in which this is taking place, you realize that what Ukraine is doing is actually far more substantial and potentially far more impactful than anything we've seen up to this point. And potentially it could become a game-changing moment if this pressure continues. Quick note as we dive in. If you watch Western media, you will notice that it is very rare indeed to see all the different details I'm going to discuss today being brought together into such a cohesive narrative that shows a clear and honest trajectory of how the war in Ukraine is actually going. There's a couple of different reasons for that. Sometimes there's bias. Sometimes there's just the mere fact that there's actually not that many analysts who have been watching the war in Ukraine progress since it began, and who have been breaking down all the individual pieces and then building them back up together to see what's actually happening. That is something I've been doing for a long time, and I think that gives me a much clearer and more accurate picture than what you might see in a one-off article by somebody who does not analyze the war as their full-time job. And so if you appreciate these pictures that I bring, these details that I bring that you really don't hear very often anywhere else, at least not in this way, you can support the channel by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and becoming a channel member or a patron of the channel. And I really appreciate all the support. Finally, quick note, a lot of you are going to ask about my son and how he's doing. Right now, he's still in the hospital. He is on a good trajectory, but he's not out of the woods yet. So thank you for all of those who are asking about that. I'll continue to update you. So what's going on between Ukraine and Russia right now, and why is it such a big deal? Well, first, the context. Because if you watched my previous videos, you'll know that context is often the single most important piece of the puzzle, but is also the piece of the puzzle that is the most often missed, as people fail to make connections between events and they see events in isolation, when in a war, nothing ever happens in isolation. And if you watched previous videos, you'll know that Vladimir Putin recently accidentally revealed his greatest weakness by going to Alaska to visit with Donald Trump. And this is a piece that a lot of people missed about this event because they were so frustrated by the fact that it was happening, and I agree with those frustrations. But what a lot of people missed is the significance of the mere fact that Vladimir Putin decided to go to Alaska in the first place, and that this revealed that Vladimir Putin was deathly terrified of what Donald Trump was threatening. And he went to Alaska to try to get that to not happen, and in fact, for the time being, he was actually successful. But just because he was successful in assuaging Donald Trump doesn't mean he was successful in assuaging the rest of the world, notably Ukraine. Ukraine has identified Vladimir Putin's weakness that he revealed at his summit with Donald Trump, and they are now pushing on that pressure point as hard as they can to exploit the thing that Putin fears the most. What Putin showed when he met with Donald Trump was that he feared the secondary sanctions that Trump was threatening. But more specifically, he didn't just fear the secondary sanctions themselves, which would put pressure on other countries that were trading with Russia and would therefore cause a lot of them to reduce or stop trading with Russia. But Putin actually feared the underlying economic impact that would happen as a result of those secondary sanctions, showing that right now Putin thinks that Russia's economy is one of the weakest aspects of the war. We know this is the case because Putin has famously been very terrified of meeting with foreign leaders and leaving Russian soil to go to foreign soil for a number of reasons. He's terrified of contracting diseases, he's terrified of assassination attempts, and even for those who say Putin is just using a body double and so there was no actual threat to him, using a body double is still risky because people can notice that, and in fact, potentially have noticed that in this case. And that brings shame on Vladimir Putin in a different way, which is why he hasn't just had unlimited international meetings just using his body doubles in his place. And so whatever the case, we see that Putin has put some of his biggest fears to the side to coordinate this meeting with Donald Trump to try to avoid more sanctions, more pressure on the Russian economy. Putin seems to know, and probably far more than we know, that any additional pressure that is put on the Russian economy right now could potentially push things quickly past the breaking point, beyond the point that the Russian economy can actually handle, beyond the point that he can handle in terms of propaganda narratives, beyond the point that the home front will be willing to tolerate that. And this move with Trump is far from the first signal that we've seen of that. We've seen this in the indicators of the Russian economy itself, in very high inflation and very high interest rates. We've seen this in Vladimir Putin making statements to the Russian people that he will reduce the defense budget next year because he knows the war is causing things to spiral downwards on the home front. And so with Putin knowing this, and the rest of the world knowing this very clearly now, Ukraine is ramping up the pressure. And specifically, they are increasing their strikes on Russian energy infrastructure in ways that we haven't yet seen up to this point. There's a couple of significant and largely unprecedented aspects to this, three of which I'll discuss in this video. The first is Ukraine ramping up strikes on port infrastructure that loads energy onto Shadow Fleet tankers. I've talked about this before. The second is Ukraine striking repeatedly the oil pipeline that delivers oil from Russia to Hungary and Slovakia, the two remaining European countries that continue to buy Russian oil. And the third is a change in tactics in the way that Ukraine is striking Russian oil refineries, where they are striking these targets not just once, but on a repeated basis, making a concerted effort to actually fully take refineries offline, which is a very significant change. So first, let's talk about Ukraine hitting the energy infrastructure that's actually used to load energy onto Russia's Shadow Fleet tankers, because this is very significant when viewed in light of the failure of Trump to actually put significant pressure on Russia as a result of the talks in Alaska. A lot of people are disappointed by this because a lot of people wanted to see the United States put sanctions on Russia to stop Russia from getting revenues from their Shadow Fleet, which is continuing to help support the Russian economy. What a lot of people have kind of missed, though, is that sanctions are not the only way to stop those revenues from flowing. Ukraine has and has always had the option to stop these energy revenues by actually taking direct military action. And it's actually not all that hard. The vast majority of Russia's Shadow Fleet revenue flows through two places, either the Black Sea or the Baltic Sea. And it is getting loaded onto ships in these locations at a very small number of facilities. Meaning that at a time of their choosing, Ukraine has always had the ability to shut down Russia's Shadow Fleet trade by taking these facilities offline in a way that they've already shown they can hit all sorts of military targets and civilian targets, infrastructure targets within Russia. The fact that Ukraine hasn't done this up to this point is actually Ukraine kind of throwing a bone to the United States, throwing a bone to the West that really doesn't want Ukraine to do this for a variety of reasons. And Ukraine has been kind of pushing the West to actually take action against the shadow fleet so that they didn't have to. Today, Donald Trump has failed to put those sanctions on Russia. And so Ukraine is showing that they are ready and potentially willing to actually take these facilities offline. And that's a very significant development, because not only does it mean that Ukraine can ultimately have largely the same impact that they would have gotten if Donald Trump had in fact put the secondary sanctions on countries that are continuing to trade with Russia, but it also means that Ukraine will get the credit instead of Donald Trump. And in fact, that might be the signal here, with Ukraine kind of showing Donald Trump that if he wants to be the one who gets credit for bringing about peace between Russia and Ukraine, he better take action, and he better take it quickly, because Ukraine is finally done playing games and finally ready to take actions into their own hands. Ukraine has hit energy infrastructure nearby the port facilities that are used to load energy onto Russia's shadow fleet before. I've talked about it in previous videos, all the way back in the early months of this year. But what Ukraine has now done within the past week is different. Ukraine has now directly hit a facility that was responsible for loading energy onto shadow fleet tankers, meaning that if Ukraine chooses to continue ramping up these strikes, they could potentially take a large portion, if not the entire Russian shadow fleet, offline and effectively eliminate Russia's ability to continue earning the vast majority of their revenues. The key question here is, will Ukraine continue to put sustained pressure on these types of facilities, or will this be a one-off event to try to do some political signaling to Donald Trump before they do that? Right now, it seems that Ukraine is in a position where they may want to and be capable of repeated pressure. First of all, because that is the trend with all of their energy strikes right now that marks them as different from anything we've seen in the war. I'll talk about that in just a second. But also because in the context of all of this, Ukraine has announced their new Flamingo long-range cruise missile that they can use to hit targets within Russia. And so far, they haven't actually even used this. All the strikes I'm talking about have been done with Ukraine's previous capabilities, drone strikes and things like that. But once Flamingos come into the picture, which can pack a much larger punch and can hit much deeper within Russia, these facilities could potentially be taken offline in a much more serious way. And when you look at the overall strategy Ukraine is pursuing in regards to energy, it looks like they might finally be willing to do this, to finally say enough is enough. People have been trading with Russia for a long time. We've expressed our frustration about this. We're done. And another key signal of that is the fact that Ukraine has struck the oil pipeline that Russia uses to trade oil to Hungary and Slovakia. And they've struck it not just once, but twice, despite complaints from Hungary and Slovakia, which is another signal of Ukraine basically saying, we are ready to cut off Russian energy revenues wherever they are. Within this context, then, is where Ukraine's new approach to striking Russian oil refineries starts to look really, really significant, even though to a lot of people, it might just seem like more of the same. It's not more of the same, though, not at all. Ukraine has had an approach to striking Russian oil refineries and really energy infrastructure in general throughout the war that has been, generally speaking, they hit a Russian oil refinery once, and then they find a different Russian oil refinery somewhere in a different region of the country to hit next. And they are not really doing repeated strikes on the refineries, and this allows the refineries to be repaired in a relatively short period of time. It still takes quite a while. Russian oil refineries don't have all their parts, but when it's a one and done on one refinery, Russia can repair those facilities. But now Ukraine is changing it up. And now Ukraine is hitting the same refineries again and again and again and again. The same refinery multiple times. And that is making a concerted effort to actually take individual facilities completely offline. And this is very significant. Ukraine's previous strategy might have been to poke holes in Russia's air defenses, find the weaknesses, and to not allow Russia to figure out what they were doing. And this allowed them over time to basically whittle down Russia's supplies of repair parts, whittle down their ability to repair refineries, so that when they actually wanted to make a concerted effort to take out specific facilities, Russia would be out of parts, and they would also be much lower on air defenses and things like that. Ukraine now seems to have reached a point where they are confident that Russian air defenses can't handle their strikes. They're confident that they can actually take out specific targets, and they are using that very strategically. We see Ukraine taking out specific refineries so that now there are regions within Russia that are having shortages of gasoline. We're seeing kilometer-long queues where Russians in certain regions cannot get their hands on gasoline. And a lot of these regions that are having the biggest gasoline shortages are the regions that have been having big problems when it comes to federal cohesion with the government in Moscow. These are regions where they are having bigger police shortages, for example, causing crime waves and actually causing vigilante groups that are often being funded by Russian oligarchs to go out and handle the police protection because the Russian government is no longer capable of doing that. And so what we see is in these areas that are already having a proclivity to be frustrated with the Moscow government because the Moscow government is failing, these specific regions are often being hit by even greater failures, and now they're not able to get their hands on gasoline either. And it seems to be that Ukraine is strategically using what's going on to create even more internal resentment within Russia against their government, more pressure to stop the war internally, which is just brilliant. So these are all very significant developments, and they are putting economic pressure on Russia in ways that we haven't yet seen before, where Russia is now being forced to be terrified that they could lose all their foreign markets for their energy, not because of sanctions and not because of geopolitical negotiations or diplomacy or anything like that, but actually by direct military action that Ukraine is taking against their shadow fleet and against their oil pipelines that continue to deliver them revenues. Russia is also seeing their internal cohesion being broken up directly by Ukraine in a targeted way. And the timing of all of this, I think, is very significant, because all of this has again happened coming out of these failed peace talks, quote unquote peace talks, to try to end the war in Ukraine, which every analyst knew would not end the war in Ukraine because Russia and Ukraine were too far apart. But what we see is Ukraine punishing Russia in a very real way for not giving them any concessions in the previous peace talks. And this is not just good military strategy. This is very, very good diplomatic strategy when it comes to Ukraine thinking about the end game for the war, which will ultimately probably end with the Ukrainian government sitting down with some representative of the Russian government, probably not Vladimir Putin. It'll probably be after he falls out of power, and coming to an agreement where they are going to demand concessions from Russia. The best way for Ukraine to psychologically put Russia in a place where they are going to actually give concessions to Ukraine is for Ukraine to punish Russia in very severe and new ways every time that Russia fails to end the war in so-called peace talks. And so we see the peace talks failing, which nobody was surprised about. Ukraine choosing that moment to reveal their new Flamingo cruise missile. Ukraine choosing that moment to show Russia, we can take out your shadow fleet revenues. And Ukraine choosing that moment to put the internal pressure on Russia in ways that they haven't yet seen. All of these developments do show that Ukraine can take out the Russian economy at a time of their choosing. And so a lot of people might say, well, if that's true, why hasn't Ukraine done it yet? And I will say what I've said so many times about this war. Everybody thinks Ukraine is playing the short game, but Ukraine is actually playing the long game. Ukraine understands that the best moment to actually produce an end to the war with economic pressure is a moment where Russia already feels so weakened that they can't take enough, that the additional pressure pushes them over the edge. If Ukraine put this economic pressure on Russia too early, for example, when Russia still felt strong, when Russia still had reserves that it could rely on, the Russian people might have felt wounded but not defeated, and they might have decided to continue fighting. Also, Russia might have had a bigger chance of having their international partners intervene to actually help them. And so Ukraine has, I think, been biding their time and trying to pick their moment when Russia is actually close to defeat to actually take those final steps, take those final shots, and push Russia over the edge. If people think that Russia is fighting a war that it can win, their international partners, they'd be more inclined to help them. If Russia's international partners think that Russia can no longer win, then they're going to be less inclined to actually help them. And that's something that we've seen on the Ukrainian side as well, where a big part of Russia's propaganda efforts have been to convince the Western world that Ukraine is fighting an unwinnable war, and therefore it's a waste of time, a waste of resources, and a waste of lives to help Ukraine. Ukraine is trying to do the same thing to Russia with its partners like China and North Korea and Iran, but they're trying to do it in a real way, not with words, not with propaganda narratives, but with actual actions. So all in all, this could be a big development, or it could be Ukraine just giving a little preview of what might ultimately come to a head at some point in the future. We really don't know yet, but one thing is certain. This is definitely a step in the right direction. I hope you've appreciated this video, and I hope you found that I brought out details that you're not really hearing anywhere else. That's always my goal, and I work really hard to do that. If you do appreciate that, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Those are both completely free, but they help me out a lot. And if you would like to support my work financially, I really do appreciate that. There are several ways you can do that in the description of this video. I don't expect paid support from anybody, but I really do appreciate it, and it really does help keep me going. If you want to see more parts of this ongoing analysis, be sure to check out one of these videos on screen.